All right, everyone. Well, welcome so much to our special evening session. We're glad to have you back with us, or if you're joining us for the first time at this conference. We are live, but virtually here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory in the heart of the Métis Nation. And some of us are coming in from other locations that they can let you know about. And yeah, we're here for a special evening session, which discusses the idea of MCC as an incubator and a catalyst. And we have 3 great presentations and an open discussion, of course, to follow to explore these ideas. And I'll just say, having sat here through all these wonderful panels that preceded this, I think those ideas are definitely forefront in my mind, the way that MCC may have emerged as sort of in certain locations as kind of almost a laboratory of sorts for testing out different ideas, but in the field, on the go, in this global context of development, maybe springing certain things. We had a panel on immigration to start us off, right? Springing certain things like the private sponsorship into action as well, kind of being at the forefront of some changes. And so I'm really excited to introduce these 3 presenters who will hopefully carry us further along this way in new discussions. And then I encourage you to think about questions you might have as we move forward. You can just put them in the Q&A right away as they're fresh in your mind, and we'll come back to them. Please feel free again to introduce yourself in the chat or share your own experience with MCC as we go along. So the other folks in the room with me here are Dr. Ryan Patterson, who will be speaking first, and Ryan is a historian and research associate with Carleton University Disability Research Group in Ottawa. He's interested in disability history. He has studied the MCC's role in the founding of Disabled Peoples International and the Canadian Independent Living Centres. And his presentation is based on a series of published articles available open access on the Carleton University Disability Research Group website. And we can always get Ryan to put that in the chat as well, so we can locate those. The next presenter we'll have is Allison Ends, who's a food security and livelihood coordinator with MCC Canada. She provides guidance on MCC's food security and livelihood international programming and supports the MCC's country programming and local partners in project development and management. And we were talking a lot about food and agriculture this afternoon, so excited to continue that discussion as it might relate. And finally, we've got Paul Heidebrecht. He's the inaugural director of the Kindred Credit Union Center for Peace Advancement and teaches courses in peace and conflict studies at Conrad Grebel University College in Waterloo, Ontario, where I was lucky enough to spend a couple months back in 2019. Prior to his current role, he's the director of MCC Canada's Ottawa office for 5 years. He had also served at the MCC on short-term assignments in Nigeria and in Bangladesh. So welcome so much to all of our presenters. And we'll turn it over now. We have about 20 minutes, I think, as we discussed, for each person to individually reflect on their particular area of interest and research, and then we will turn to the question period. So please, Ryan, take us away.
Thank you. I'll just start by sharing here. Here we go. Okay, thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone for coming. Disabled Peoples International is a worldwide nonprofit organization that serves as a voice for disabled people, a voice of disabled people, a focal point for representation, and a call for the human right of all people to live without physical or social barriers. Today, I'm going to explore briefly how in 1981, the MCC of Canada became pivotal to the founding of Disabled Peoples International and to a real movement for disability rights in Canada. In addition to much needed funding, the MCC provided contacts and credibility as a known, reliable charitable organization. Most important was its sustained support of talented individuals through the Volunteer Service Worker Program. And unless otherwise noted, MCC in this case study refers to MCC Canada. I just don't want to say that extra C every single time because that's when I start flubbing my entire talk. Research travel for this paper was kindly supported by the MCC at 100 Research Grant Scheme and the Carleton University Disability Research Group. Today, I will focus on the bits, particularly about MCC's role as a supporting institution. And if you'd like any more detail, I will post links to the full articles on which are open access on the group chat, as has been brilliantly suggested. I'm using a PowerPoint presentation of images, and I will briefly describe each slide's contents for accessibility purposes. And I'll start by introducing you all, though I know that many of you won't need an introduction, to Henry Enns. New slide showing Henry Enns in 1988, a middle-aged man in a wheelchair with light, short, curly hair and glasses. He is speaking into a microphone. That's my description voice. Henry was born in Russia. His parents fled the country when he was very young, passing first through East and West Germany, then Paraguay, before ultimately settling in Steinbach, Manitoba in 1954 when Henry was 11 years old. He developed rheumatoid arthritis in his high school years, and by graduation, this caused so much pain that he required a wheelchair. When he applied to study social work at the University of Winnipeg, the school at first resisted because the campus was not wheelchair accessible. A persuasive and positive personality, Enns convinced the registrar to allow him to stay. He excelled in his studies and completed a Bachelor of Social Work, having friends carry him and his wheelchair into and out of the buildings and lecture halls. After graduating, he worked as a community development officer with the Manitoba League of the Physically Handicapped and helped to found the Coalition of Provincial Organizations of the Handicapped, the first national level multidisciplinary organization in Canada. Now, the term handicapped was the standard at the time, if not universally accepted. It's in a lot of the associations and quotes, and so it will come up several times during this talk. Enns was Mennonite, and that was one of the reasons I believe that his family had fled the Soviet Union. In 1979, he submitted a proposal to the MCC in Winnipeg. The volunteer service program, as I think everyone here will know, was a pillar of the MCC's charitable work and provided financial support to voluntary service workers, or VSers, serving 2 to 3 year assignments on MCC projects. Now, the support was not a salary. It's intended to cover basic living expenses. So it's a support for volunteering that allows people to volunteer longer than they might otherwise be able to. By 1981, MCC Canada would have 92 volunteers on VS programs, rising to 115 and then 140 in the successive years. Partly through Enns' work and example, disability issues became an increasing focus of the VS program over the decade. The MCC Canada program director, Dave Dyke, had a personal interest in accessibility and, along with Enns, in 1980 created the MCC Canada Handicap Awareness Project, later renamed Handicapped Concerns. The project centered on Enns serving a 2-year, later repeatedly extended, voluntary service assignment as a consultant on disability issues. The initial plan was for him to spend 2 to 3 months in each province working across the country, conducting workshops at constituent conferences and conference schools to raise awareness of disability issues and develop an advisory committee in each province to pursue greater integration of the disabled members in each constituent community. Within a few years, the project mandate had expanded to include making every constituent church and building wheelchair accessible, developing a new system of independent living centers to allow those with disabilities to live outside of institutions, and supporting the early years of Disabled Peoples International. Dave Dyke enshrined in policy that at least 50% of the Handicap Concerns Committee be disabled or the parents of a disabled child. It was during this time with the Handicapped Awareness Project and with the support of the VS program that Henry Enns attended the 1980 Rehabilitation International World Congress as a delegate from Canada. Rehabilitation International, or RI, is a worldwide organization devoted to improving the quality of life of people with disabilities. It has member organizations in more than 100 countries, and it's comprised of service providers, government agencies, academics, researchers, and advocates, both with and without disabilities. This is a new slide showing a Canada postage stamp issued in May 1980 in recognition of the upcoming 14th World Congress of RI in Winnipeg. It is a blue stamp with an illustration of 2 hands clasping as if one is helping the other up. It's for 17 cents, because apparently that's what letters cost to send back then. At the 1980 World Congress, Enns and 250 other disabled representatives from 14 countries passionately argued that the medical professionals, supportive as they were overrepresented in the leadership of RI and received comparatively little practical input from the disabled people themselves. They decided that a worldwide autonomous organization of disabled persons was needed, in which disabled people would make the decisions about how best to represent themselves. Henry Enns and Jim Dirksen of Canada were both elected to an ad hoc planning committee to work out the form that this new organization would take, and they proposed the name World Coalition of Persons with Disabilities. This was within a year later changed to Disabled Peoples International, or DPI. And for simplicity, I'll only use DPI going forward, though technically it's the first name for the first bit. This is a new slide showing the circular logo for DPI. A green globe is surrounded by patterned red spokes. The name of the association forms the outside of the circle, along with the phrase Vox Nostra. DPI would be composed entirely of people with disabilities and be multi-disability, as opposed to the many existing associations that would be specifically for blind, deaf, single disability. The proposal stated that the coalition would, quote, be based on the philosophy of equal opportunity and full participation of handicapped people in all aspects of society as a matter of justice rather than of charity, end quote. Membership in DPI would be open to all organizations of handicapped people, meaning those organizations whose governing board, council, and general membership were at least 50% disabled. It's like with stock, right? A controlling interest. A formal steering committee was then elected and 2 representatives selected from 7 regions of the world. Henry Enns was voted as the chairperson. There was much to do. The steering committee met regularly, prepared a constitution based partly on that of the International Labor Organization, and decided to hold a World Congress of Disabled People in conjunction with the United Nations, and they were going to hold it in Singapore. Singapore was then an emerging economy and thought to be a good practical balance symbolically and practically between the first world and the developing world. It was important to organize this event quickly because the UN had declared 1981 as the International Year of Disabled Persons. It would be the perfect time to introduce the world to Disabled Peoples International. This is a new slide showing the original document header for DPI from 1982. It is a green block showing the name of the association in 5 languages and the stylized letters DPI with several images of people with very different disabilities. DPI was founded upon the social model of disability, and in part a rejection of the medical model of disability, which to very oversimplified is medical model is disability is an illness and needs to be cured or treated. Social model is that disability is an identity, a type of person. This philosophical principle had prompted the split with Rehabilitation International. The founding members repeatedly drew attention to the contemporary UN figure that 10% of the world population was disabled, roughly equal to the population of India. This was no niche group. They were, of course, a very diverse group, but the founders of DPI nonetheless felt that all disabled people shared a common overlapping set of concerns and a sense of shared identity. Jim Dirksen later contended that, quote, rehabilitation tries to change the disabled person to accommodate society. Our organizations accept that many disabilities are permanent and tries to change society so that it accommodates disabled people, end quote. New slide showing a scan of a pink document titled MCC Canada VS Job Description. The pertinent info from this document and slide will be read throughout the following section. With the time and place now decided, the newly elected chairman, Henry Enns, submitted a form to the MCC VS program requesting a volunteer to work for 1 year as a community development officer. He explained in the request that, quote, the main emphasis of the project is to organize the World Conference in Singapore, end quote. And it's worth highlighting that he was thus asking the MCC to materially support a secular organization as part of its charitable mandate. Quote, our organization is concerned about improving the living conditions of some 500 million people on Earth, he wrote in his VS request form. Many of our members are Christians, but the organization is not a Christian organization, end quote. Enns recruited Diane Drieger, a university student he had met while they were both volunteering with the Manitoba League of the Physically Handicapped. A non-disabled person with an interest in social movements, she was excited at the prospect. She was also a member of the Mennonite community. Drieger applied and was approved for a one-year voluntary service position with DPI starting in May 1981. New slide showing Henry Enns and Jim Dirksen, a seated man with a large dark beard. The first Secretariat office for the fledgling Disabled Peoples International was established in a strip mall in Winnipeg. In fact, a shared space with the Manitoba League of Persons with Disabilities that consisted of little more than 2 desks. Jim Dirksen joined Enns and Drieger in the office. Dirksen had been elected along with Enns to the original planning committee that designed the structure of DPI and was now employed as a part-time DPI acting international coordinator. A wheelchair user due to polio, Dirksen grew up in Morris, Manitoba. Though not at that point a practicing member, he was of Mennonite descent and familiar with Mennonite culture. Drieger later recalled that, quote, "The fact that all 3 of us were Mennonites, I think that's a very important factor," end quote. Their shared culture provided shortcuts to communication and understanding and a uniting of purpose, which Drieger likened to a long marriage. With the immense task that lay ahead of them, this anchoring was, quote, "a real advantage." While MCC Canada provided substantial material support to this Winnipeg office, there was no interference in their work. The MCC leadership trusted Enns and the DPI with a wide latitude to pursue what they knew was best. In doing so, the MCC embodied the principle that disabled people should represent their own needs and interests, and were, of course, fully capable of doing so. As active volunteer service workers, both Enns and Drieger received support from the MCC in the form of living and travel expenses that allowed them to devote their energies to the significant work of organizing this new movement. Enns' volunteer service assignment was repeatedly extended to allow him to continue to perform his international work, along with his original and continuing MCC Cross-Canada accessibility projects. The Handicap Concerns program directly listed one of its objectives in 1986 as, quote, "to make staff available to serve as chairperson of Disabled Peoples International," end quote. This continued support of talented individuals represented a real practical investment on MCC's part to the founding of DPI. This is a new slide showing part of the 1981 DPI Certificate of Incorporation in Canada. The details are incidental to this talk. As the new DPI Secretariat, Dirksen and Drieger focused on raising funds for the World Congress. Enns was always traveling for his responsibilities, both as chairman of DPI and director of the MCC Handicap Awareness Program, so phoned the office every week and visited every few months or so as his schedule allowed. Enns, Dirksen, and Drieger had a wealth of experience in disability organization and advocacy between them, but no previous experience with international funding bodies or with fundraising quite on this scale. Fortunately, their connections to the MCC gave them a critical head start. An internal MCC report stated that, quote, "one of the most significant contributions MCCC has made to the rapid development of DPI has been contacts and credibility," end quote. John Whaler, the MCC Director of Overseas Projects, put Enns in touch with the MCC's, Henry Enns, in touch with the MCC's contact at the Canadian International Development Agency, or CIDA. CIDA knew the MCC as a reliable non-governmental non-governmental development agency. The very fact that DPI already had MCC support granted it legitimacy among the other funding agencies, like a reference letter, and allowed them to elicit support. It was, of course, a new association. In this particular case, CIDA provided funds to cover the first DPI steering committee held in Ireland and would contribute other funds later on. Enns pursued these shared contacts and made new ones as he attended meetings as a member of the Canadian delegation to the UN Advisory Committee for the International Year of Disabled Persons, which included funds and plans for quite a few projects. And he was in there meeting people and helping to direct those projects. His enthusiasm and optimism did much to arouse interest in DPI and generate good international visibility. Quote, "He was a salesman, very charismatic," as Drieger describes him. "He would convince you to be just involved in everything because it was the exciting thing to do," end quote. This is a new slide showing Henry Enns at a microphone podium in Singapore. Promises of funding for the Singapore event began to come together from the MCC, the UN, the California Department of Rehabilitation, and the governments of Sweden and Canada. The team in Winnipeg was then able to turn their attention to travel planning, especially for the many disability advocates around the world who wished to attend the World Congress, but could not possibly do so without financial assistance. We didn't have Zoom then, of course. They would still need some of the financial assistance with Zoom. As Drieger, let's not do a alternate history there. As Drieger described the challenges of her average day, quote, "We have to figure out how to get so-and-so from Dakar, Senegal to Singapore. And these were the days when there was no internet. We had to do everything by telegram or telex," end quote. This methodology required a high level of trust between the Secretariat office staff, the hosts in Singapore, and a diverse group of disabled delegates who had, at that point, most of them never actually met. Moreover, the Winnipeg team had no way of knowing if the tickets they sent to DPI delegates far and wide would actually reach their destinations in time, and often had no communication way to even be told if they had. The many leaps of faith, large and small, that so many individuals and organizations made at this time were evidence of the powerful sense of group solidarity on which DPI was being founded. This is a new slide showing some of the DPI World Council in Singapore. The first DPI World Congress took place as scheduled from November 29th through December 4th, 1981. Enns was elected deputy chair of the new DPI World Council, comprised exclusively of disabled representatives. The Secretariat team were thrilled to find that all but 3 of the subsidized delegates had received their tickets and made it to the conference. In total, 400 people with disabilities from 51 countries arrived in Singapore to participate. A full half of them would not have been able to attend without the subsidy program organized in Winnipeg and supported by the MCC. After the Singapore World Congress, Henry Enns continued to promote DPI and its mandate on the world stage. He contributed to the formation of the UN World Programme of Action Concerning Disabled Persons, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1982. At that time, 80% of disabled people lived in the developing world. I'm not saying it's wildly different now, but the known number at the time was 80% lived in the developing world. And in some countries, 20% of the total population lived with acquired disabilities due to malnutrition, communicable disease, and preventable disease. As a special UN International Year of the Disabled Person Project, in 1982, Enns and Drieger embarked on a fact-finding trip through Sri Lanka, Thailand, Singapore, and Japan to assess the condition of disabled people and the range of disability associations and supports available. They visited and reported both to the UN and to the MCC on schools for the deaf, the blind, and the developmentally disabled, a vocational training center, a veterans hospital, a supported living residence, and a fundraising telethon. As part of its continued support for DPI, MCC paid for Enns and Drieger's travel expenses. This is a new slide showing Enns, the Honorable Jake Epp, and Alan Simpson in 1986 announcing funding for Canadian independent living centers. In 1983, Enns attended the UN launch of the Decade of Disabled Persons, which runs from 1983 to 1992, something he had been advocating for quite some time. He continued to serve as the director of handicapped awareness and its successor, Handicap Concerns, from the program's inception in 1980 until 1986, while also working variously as the chairman, deputy chair, and UN spokesperson for DPI. His energy and passion were so inexhaustible that when he left the position in '86, the MCC established an entire committee to take up his duties. He was supported through all of this work through the volunteer service program. Disabled Peoples International has continued to this day to act as a voice for disabled people and a focal point for self-representation, and also directs a great deal of good, both charitable and development support work. The Mennonite Central Committee of Canada supported this fledgling institution when it needed it the most at the very beginning. By the way, they did continue for some time afterwards. It put its trust in talented and motivated members of the constituent community, allowing them to do what they knew was right. Through this open-handed utilization of human and material resources, the MCC was truly a catalyst for positive change in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for that fascinating presentation, and we look forward to discussing it further as we move into the question period. It just struck me as you were speaking, Erica Little Wolf in our evening session yesterday talked about that resistance to relinquishing control, right? And sometimes funding and support kind of comes with these strings and ties attached. So it's interesting how you highlight this willingness to support but not dictate in this case, and maybe we can talk a bit more about that as we move on. Yeah, and I'm just going to roll right into the next presentation, which is Allison Ends. I'm going to turn it over to you now. So you have 20 minutes or so, and we'll come back after that.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for the introduction and for this opportunity to share about the history of MCC's work in fair trade. As was mentioned, I work with MCC on food security and livelihood programming. And so I do want to acknowledge that I have not worked with 10,000 Villages or specifically in the fair trade sector. I've had the opportunity to participate in conversations and studies about the impact of 10,000 Villages on artisan livelihoods. And it's an honor to share elements of the 10,000 Villages story with you today. Throughout my presentation, I will be sharing some pictures from MCC's archives and of artisans from recent years. I hope these pictures help bring to life these stories. Faith communities have played an important role in developing the principles and practices of fair trade globally. Mennonite communities, and MCC in particular, were critical to the development of the fair trade industry in Canada and the United States. MCC, through self-help crafts and then 10,000 Villages, was active in fair trade for nearly 75 years, with a mission to create opportunities for artisans in developing countries to earn income by bringing their products and stories to our markets through long-term fair trading relationships. Mennonite involvement in fair trade began when a woman named Edna Ruth Byler visited Puerto Rico with her husband in the late 1940s. She saw the embroidery that women there were making, but had no place to sell. So she purchased a few items and returned to the United States to sell their work out of the trunk of her car. As interest grew, she started selling products in church basements and fellowship halls. In 1962, Byler's work became an official MCC program when it became too large for her to manage on her own. She stayed on as program manager, and the work continued to grow and eventually became known as self-help crafts. Throughout its history, self-help crafts, or what later became known as 10,000 Villages, experienced the tensions that are somewhat inherent in the fair trade sector. And there are many. This includes the tension between compliance with World Fair Trade Organization regulations and resources for capacity building, the tension between providing customer education and being competitive in the market, and the tension between ensuring positive impact on the well-being of artisans and growing a sustainable business. None of these are mutually exclusive goals, but they rely on one another for a fair trade business to succeed. The history of 10,000 Villages shows that these goals are intertwined. It also shows what the challenges are and how these tensions can play out over time. Tonight, I'd like to share with you some of the stories of the beginnings of 10,000 Villages, with a focus on what some of these tensions looked like as the organization grew. As mentioned, what started as a more informal reselling of handicrafts grew into an MCC program. That included opening the first store in 1972. During this time, the work was becoming more official, and so program goals were more clearly articulated. The wording changes slightly through decades of reports and planning documents, but the foundational principles that self-help crafts was built on are quite consistent. A 1978 program review articulates the two main objectives of the program. The first was to provide employment to handmade craft producers by operating a marketing and sales program in North America. This meant trust-based and transparent trading arrangements with handicraft suppliers and good working conditions and fair prices for artisans. These are now considered standard principles for fair trade products. There is an assumption as part of this goal that providing employment will improve the well-being of artisans, although it's not explicitly framed in this way. The second objective was to produce and provide educational materials to go along with the products, to help customers understand the contexts of the developing countries where the handicrafts were made. These objectives were part of an intentional strategy by MCC to challenge the alienating effects of the global marketplace. At that time, the term fair trade wasn't common language yet. Instead, self-help crafts was considered one of the first alternative trade organizations, or ATOs. ATOs emerged globally as a response to poverty in the global south, inequitable trade practices, and to the charity model. It was meant to be an alternative to traditional trade models, where profits are shared with producers. So just as self-help crafts was trying to challenge the alienating effects of the global marketplace, more broadly, the ATO movement was about working both in and against the market. But there are many challenges with this goal. Relying on standard business models won't necessarily achieve the range of outcomes that ATOs desire. Critiques of this approach say that participation in the market does not necessarily mean empowerment, especially if the global market is understood to be exploitative by nature. So how did self-help crafts approach working in and against the market? An internal study in the late 1970s observed that a commitment to creating employment meant that a sales-oriented approach was needed. This did mean, however, that objectives such as customer education and the broader needs of artisans often got lost as a factor in decision-making. An excerpt from that study reads, quote, "At some point, the decision between the demands of the customer and the interest of low-volume producers will clash." We can look to some examples of these quote-unquote clashes throughout the history of self-help crafts to better understand how this was managed over time. Early on, the decisions about what to sell and who to work with was not necessarily centered around what would bring in the most profit. For example, Byler turned down the opportunity to sell large-scale African paintings because they did not represent a native skill that was part of traditional cultural practices, something that the self-help crafts philosophy required at the time. Byler was also focused on supporting the neediest artisans, and as a result, discontinued the sale of Korean brass products in 1965 because it was felt that their sale was not actually helping people in the most need. This decision resulted in pushback from some people within MCC, since these products sold quite well. Ultimately, though, MCC stood behind the decision. Similarly, self-help crafts ended the relationship with the supplier in Jordan because it felt that sales were mostly benefiting the owner of the production and not the artisans themselves. In response to this account closing, the executive secretary at the time said that they would, quote, "like to say with all honesty that everything that the public purchases is going to help the individuals who produced it." This approach is in line with reporting and planning documents from that time. These mention that producer needs should always override North American wants, and that the primary purpose of self-help crafts should always be for the artisans. In practice, this meant it should be self-supporting and not competing for MCC donations, and that any profits should go back into the program to expand and to serve artisans. And profits did grow. For example, sales tripled in just 4 years, from $1.2 million in 1982 to $3.6 million in 1986. During this growth, there was debate within MCC about pricing strategies and how to stimulate growth. MCC leaders debated if it was ethical to generate profit from self-help crafts, considering the foundations it was based on. Byler had emphasized that all profits should go back to the producers, and some within the Mennonite community were not supportive of promoting what they felt like was consumerism. In the end, however, MCC decided to pursue higher profits by increasing prices. Still, sales slowed in the 1990s as more and more imported goods were filling the market, which made it hard for self-help crafts to compete and to stay profitable so that it could be self-supporting. The self-help craft CEO concluded that self-help crafts had carried its producer focus to the extreme by ignoring consumer demand. This led to a new strategy that focused even more on price, product quality, and artisan capacity building. This new strategy also led to a rebranding with a new name, 10,000 Villages. This new name was inspired by a quote from Mahatma Gandhi: "India is not to be found in its few cities, but in the 700,000 villages." While MCC grappled with how to balance producer focus and consumer demand in North America, they were simultaneously working on these issues through other programs. The job creation program in Bangladesh, for example, further highlights these dynamics. A bit of background. MCC started the job creation program in Bangladesh in 1974. The goal was to create income-generating employment opportunities for disadvantaged women. This involved handicraft projects that could employ women and provide other skills like literacy and nutrition trainings. The goal was for these projects to eventually become independent from MCC as fully operational businesses. There is a lot of overlap between these goals and those of 10,000 Villages. While Villages was oriented to selling products to North American consumers, MCC Bangladesh was oriented toward the artisans and creating the kinds of businesses that Villages would eventually purchase products from. There were 4 stages that MCC used to develop these projects in Bangladesh. The first was research and development of an idea and handicraft product. The second was to test production and to pilot the idea. Third was to move into full operation and production. And the last stage was independence from MCC. There was an intentional focus on strong accompaniment from MCC staff during the first 3 stages. The strategy was to ensure that capacity and skills were developed internally within the business before becoming independent. This focus on independence was what made the program unique at the time, especially compared to other organizations doing similar work. The job creation program was clear that long-term job creation requires relatively long-term work. The businesses started through the job creation program sold handicrafts to self-help crafts and later to Villages US and Villages Canada. But these were only some of their buyers. Others included Oxfam and Global Village, and this was intentional as independence from MCC meant also having a diverse and strong relationship with many different buyers. Although they operated separately, Self-Help Crafts and the Job Creation Program in Bangladesh both dealt with the tension between the need for economic growth, sustainability, and profitability, while also maintaining the goal of improving artisan livelihood. There was some disagreement and debate around MCC's focus on establishing independent businesses. An evaluation of the Job Creation Program done in 1999 raised significant questions about cost and efforts put into the program compared to the tangible benefits received by artisans. As part of that evaluation, calculations showed that on average, each producer received $363 each year, or about $1.15 per day. When compared to the investments MCC was putting into the program, the evaluation showed that for every dollar spent by MCC on subsidies for the program, producers only earned 68 cents. If income generation was meant to be the most significant impact, the evaluation argued that the job creation program was not an efficient way of achieving it. It said that, quote, MCC Bangladesh should become more clear about whether it is creating businesses or whether it is creating jobs. MCC staff, however, took issue with this dichotomy. A focus on developing successful, profitable, and sustainable businesses was the intention of the program. While it took significant resources to develop projects to get to that point, they felt strongly that this was an appropriate approach and would be the most impactful in creating jobs in the long term. While this point could be debated, it is notable how many businesses were started by MCC Bangladesh through the job creation program that are still operating today and have provided employment for over 20 years. This includes Prokriti, Shuktara, Action Bay Handicrafts, and Eastern Screen Printers, among others. It can also be argued that this dichotomy between businesses and jobs is missing an important question, one about the impact of fair trade on artisan well-being. Jobs may have been created, but what are the impact of these jobs? Throughout its history, Villages has not often measured and monitored its impact on artisans' well-being beyond anecdotal information. There are many challenges in trying to do this in a more systematic and quantitative way. But in 2019, MCC Canada commissioned an impact evaluation to better understand if and how Villages has impacted artisan well-being. This study looked at a small portion of the work that Villages does, specifically in India and Nepal. It found that handicraft sales represent an important source of income for artisans, often contributing 50 to 75% of total household income. Many artisans that were interviewed highlighted the social supports they received through fair trade work, such as healthcare, literacy classes, and improved communication skills. The evaluation found that quantifying this impact is extremely difficult because of the wide variety of producer groups that Villages works with. The impact of 10,000 Villages on the businesses, however, was quite clear. All of the businesses interviewed said that partnering with Villages strengthened their ability to produce and sell to other buyers when they first started. Villages is among the oldest buyers for groups, and the support and technical assistance provided over the years helped improve producer capacity and sales, and to build momentum and reputation. Support from Villages included design and technical support, flexible payment arrangements, shipping support, leeway with delays in fulfilling orders, and payment advances. The evaluation concluded that the long-term impact on producer groups by selling to a well-known and respected buyer like Villages and generating a long-term business relationship with regular orders and payments cannot be overstated. MCC's work through 10,000 Villages came to an end in Canada last year, but continues in the United States today. The challenges of running a profitable and sustainable fair trade business are very real. But there's also a rich history in the story of 10,000 Villages, a history that started many years ago with one woman's desire to make a difference, and one that is still felt today in the many businesses that MCC helped to start and artisans around the world that are continuing to work, in part because of the early support of MCC and self-help crafts. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for that presentation as well, Allison. There's so many nice points of intersection with our first presentation by Ryan, and so I think we can draw those out. Particularly this question again about creating sort of space for autonomy, even within a network of support initially. So I look forward to discussing that. I realize in my excitement, I think I'm in my role supposed to actually introduce the titles to your presentations, but it feels like it would be wrong to do that for Paul now, but I forgot to do it for the first two. So you're on your own, Paul, but you can take it away whenever you're ready, and then we'll come back together for questions. So feel free to start putting those in the Q&A button, folks.
Thanks, Ben. And good evening to everyone. I'm joining you from my home in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The title of my paper, I don't hit all the marks of the title, so skipping over it might be all right. But the title is Growing but Also Gifting and Failing MCC as an Incubator for New Approaches to Relief, Development, and Peace. And I really do not, unfortunately, get much into the failing element of this, which is perhaps the most interesting. MCC, of course, has grown dramatically over the past century by many typical measures, whether that's geographic scope, size of operating budget, and the number of volunteers, staff, and partners. MCC is now impressively large. These measures, however, significantly underestimate the reach and impact of MCC over the past 100 years because MCC has also spun off an astonishing number of independent organizations. Many of these continue to thrive and have developed in interesting and unanticipated ways. This evening, I'll attempt to demonstrate that our retelling of the MCC story requires the inclusion of the stories of numerous institutions that no longer bear MCC's name. The point is not to emphasize the importance of MCC, but to better understand some of the factors that made this organizational culture possible. The genesis of this project goes back more than a decade to a conference marking MCC's 90th anniversary that included papers pointing to the way MCC has been a key player in and a catalyst for the creation and establishment of numerous other inter-Mennonite institutions. And these papers were subsequently grouped together in a section called Birthing New Programs, MCC as Incubator of Pioneering Projects, in the book edited by Alan F. Weaver that grew out of this conference. So I think it was Alan who first used the word incubator to describe MCC. My interest in the phenomenon of MCC as a spin-off machine only grew when I joined Conrad Grebel University College and began serving as the director of the Kindred Credit Union Center for Peace Advancement. Situated in Kitchener-Waterloo, the epicenter of Canada's tech startup scene, one distinctive feature of our center is an incubator for new peace-building initiatives. Of course, incubators to support new businesses can be found in virtually every university and reasonable sized city in North America. And so Grebel's incubator is clearly a product of its time. In contrast, MCC's pattern of incubating and then spinning off organizations struck me as more exceptional. I'm sorry.
Hey, Paul, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Are you using a different microphone? Do you mind just kind of, it sounds like it's cutting in and out a little bit. Do you mind just like repatching the?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me just double check. Thanks for alerting me to
that. It sounds like it's a loose connection, like it keeps on plugging in and out. But
how would I just switch to a different mic and see if that works?
that'd be awesome.
We won't take this off your time, Paul. You can have extra. It's no problem.
Oh, sorry, this is.
No, it's quite all right.
Okay, how is that sounding now?
That sounds great.
Is that better or the same?
It's the same. Did you switch the microphone? You did. But it sounds good right now.
Mhm.
Okay, why don't we try this?
Let's try this. I'll pipe up if it's an issue.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's really unfortunate. I'm sorry. Apologies to everybody.
No problem. Take it away.
Where was I? Oh, yeah. Okay. So hopefully people are with me. I haven't gotten to the heart of the matter yet. So if I've been cutting in and out, I'm still winding up here. So I was saying that in contrast to my own experience with modern incubators, MCC's pattern of incubating and then spinning off organizations has struck me as more exceptional and thus worth digging into further. How and why did MCC test and lay the groundwork for a good idea to take root, only to let it go? What follows is a very different presentation than many others at this conference and in this session. With apologies to the historians in this virtual space, I'll be skirting over details in order to provide more of a bird's eye view of this larger phenomenon. After that 90th anniversary conference in June 2010, I received a spreadsheet from Frank Peachy, the overseer of MCC US's archives in Akron, listing 138 organizations started by MCC in Canada, the US, and internationally. And while I'm not going to mention all 138, I do want to, and I think it's important to name as many as I can, even if that comes at the expense of detail. So I'll be mentioning a bunch. As such, this might sound a little like I'm reading off an honor roll or sharing a liturgy of blessing. So hopefully my concluding comments will complicate things a little as I reflect on the implications of this narrative for MCC's second century. How's the sound working out now?
It's not bad. I think you just need to get closer to your microphone.
Okay, I'll lean in here.
Try it.
Okay. So first section here is a preference for partnership. Arguing that a proper retelling of the MCC story requires the inclusion of the stories of institutions that don't bear MCC's name may seem rather obvious when looking at trends in MCC's global programs. For a number of decades now, MCC, like most major international development NGOs, has emphasized a partnership approach that focuses on building the capacity of local grassroots organizations. And this is reflected in a growing roster of program and project partners and fewer programs and projects that are implemented directly by MCC staff or service workers. And we've already heard an example, Allison reflecting on the context of Bangladesh and the significant number of job creation projects that have been spun off into new ventures. It's also important to note that the impact of those program implementing partners is certainly captured and celebrated by MCC in its regular reporting and communications channels. So given that many, if not most of these partners and organizations are often connected to funders beyond MCC, it seems to me that MCC may actually err on the side of taking too much credit for their work these days. So what were some of the drivers behind this practice of spinning off organizations? First thing I'll talk about is new funding channels. In addition to Bangladesh, there are several other country-specific contexts that would be worth examining in greater detail, and no doubt each have interesting nuances. In order to keep this project manageable, I've been focusing, and I'll reflect more on North American examples this evening, which also includes an impressive array of diverse initiatives that became independent from MCC. And several of them were able to tap into new funding channels as a result. An obvious example to consider in this category is Canadian Food Grains Bank, or CFGB, an ecumenical partnership striving to end global hunger that now includes 14 other non-Mennonite church agencies alongside MCC. CFGB was formed as an evolution of MCC Canada's food bank program in 1983, and began to leverage significant matching funds from the Government of Canada, much more that MCC had been comfortable with at the time. Last year, I believe virtually all of the government funding received by MCC Canada came through their partnership with CFGB. A little over 8 million out of the more than $30 million that CFGB was able to secure from Global Affairs Canada. A less well-known example or case of a significant MCC birthed organization that grew by leveraging government funding is More Than a Roof, a nonprofit addressing housing and healthcare needs in British Columbia. More Than a Roof started as an MCC BC program called the Social Housing Society in 1984 and became independent in 2003. And building on an initial housing complex in Vancouver, they now manage 13 properties with over 1,000 subsidized housing units. In 2020, More Than a Roof brought in over $14 million in revenue, and total assets were valued at more than $130 million. So again, by economic measures, dwarfing MCC-BC. Numerous other social service organizations across Canada followed a similar trajectory, albeit not at this scale, and lots of examples can be found, including Craigwood Children, Youth and Family Services, which goes way back to a farm to rehabilitate delinquent boys established by MCC and Elsa Craig, Ontario in 1955. Communitas Supportive Care Society traces its roots back to some group homes established by MCC-BC's Mental Health Committee. In 1975, Momentum, a community development organization in Calgary, established by MCC Alberta in 1991. The list goes on. Carmel House in Saskatoon, Mennonite Community Services of Southern Ontario, which was incorporated in 2010, assuming responsibility for MCC Ontario's Low German programs in Aylmer. And of course, already alluded to tonight, the Independent Living Centers. That center in Waterloo region was the first independent living center in Canada, after being founded by MCC Canada in 1982. Second rationale is the search for a different kind of expertise. In other cases, offshoots were spun off relatively quickly, given their focus on activities and impacts that required a different kind of expertise in order to flourish. One prominent example goes back to World War II and the Mennonite COs who were assigned to civilian public service units working as orderlies in mental hospitals across the US. In response to the quote, deplorable conditions that volunteers witnessed, MCC formed a committee on homes for the mentally ill, which was tasked with planning, building, and guiding the operation of psychiatric hospitals in the US. And that led to the establishment of 3, one in Maryland, one in California, and one in Kansas in the late 40s and early 50s. All 3 of these grew dramatically after they were incorporated just a few years later with their own local boards and began to contract with local governments in order to provide a broader range of mental health services. And all 3 are operating with impressive scale today, employing hundreds of staff, licensed psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, and counselors in dozens of locations in each of those 3 states. If the provision of mental health care in the US in the 40s and 50s was an unlikely yet organic outgrowth of MCC's mission, so too was MCC's role in the emergence of the recycling industry in several Canadian provinces in the 1970s and 80s. And there's much more that could be said about this, but maybe the most unusual example of an MCC spinoff is the tire recycling Atlantic Canada Corporation, or TRAC, in Minto, New Brunswick, which now recycles more than 1 million used tires a year. It was first established in 1997 when MCC successfully bid on a government contract from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia to help divert tires from landfills. And MCC was the only church-affiliated bidder on that occasion. There are also examples of MCC programs in this category that continue to maintain, unlike tire recycling and provision of mental health resources, that maintain strong connections with both MCC and MCC's Mennonite constituency after they were spun off. This includes MTS Travel, which originated as MCC's travel department in 1947 and was separately incorporated in 1955. Mennonite Disaster Service, which traces its origins back to a grassroots church movement and efforts in Kansas and Manitoba in the early 50s, and operated as MCC's North American Disaster Response Program until being separately incorporated in 1993. And Roots of Justice, a nonprofit established in 2012 to carry forward and broaden the work started by MCC US in their Damascus Road anti-racism training process. A third rationale is ecosystem building. I noticed in the many and varied stories of MCC spinoffs in the Canadian context in particular, that the impact of key programs was enhanced by seeding and nurturing an ecosystem of local organizations rather than scaling up or continuing to grow and diversify MCC's own programs. The story of MCC's involvement in the emergence of the private sponsorship system for refugees in Canada is already well known and discussed in this event. MCC's role in collaborating with constituent congregations to enable thousands of refugees to resettle in Canada in the years since has also been celebrated, but less well known, I think, is MCC's role in starting a number of complementary organizations that provided language, employment, legal, and other supports for newcomers. These usually started as programmatic partnerships with local congregations, and MCC's key contributions came through administrative services and the injection of human labor, typically through seconded service workers. There was a flurry of program spin-offs in the 1980s, including the Edmonton Mennonite Center for Newcomers in 1980, the Mennonite New Life Center in Toronto in 83, Compass Refugee Services, formerly the Mennonite Coalition for Refugee Support in Kitchener-Waterloo in 87, the Center for Newcomer Society of Calgary in 1988, and the Global Gathering Place in Saskatoon, also in 88. The second instance of this ecosystem building is related to the role that MCC played in helping spark the contemporary restorative justice movement. I think in the interest of time, I'll skip over this section, but I should give a shout out to community justice initiatives in Kitchener-Waterloo, established in 1982. In Winnipeg, several initiatives, including mediation services established in 1992 and initiatives for just communities established in 2010, and the Saskatoon Community Mediation Services established in 1989. So it's important also to note that my framing of MCC as an incubator for new organizations can be stretched too thin if it's applied to every new initiative that MCC played some kind of role in establishing. After all, incubation implies a level of intentionality in nurturing or developing something new that will then go on to have a life of its own. And incubators provide very specific kinds of assistance in practice. Thus, while MCC certainly played a crucial role in the emergence of other well-known Anabaptist Mennonite organizations, such as MEDA, Mennonite Economic Development Associates, Christian Peacemaker Teams, and Mennonite Partners in China, MCC was one of several stakeholders in all of these cases, and they were all independent from the outset. The MCC story also includes one prominent example that I think has often been confused with a spin-off, 10,000 Villages. And of course, we've gotten a good introduction to villages already. I won't go over that terrain again, other than to note that as was the pattern with many other program spin-offs, MCC created separate governance bodies to oversee villages in both Canada and the US that they called boards. But in practice, in Canada, this was actually never vested with legal authority, and all staff, I think, were still technically employed by MCC. Villages did incorporate as a nonprofit in the US in I think 2012, but still retains deep financial ties with, if not outright dependence on MCC US. The organizations continue to be enmeshed and intertwined. And so I don't think, again, Villages is properly thought of as a spin-off for that reason. Other edge cases include several ecumenical and civil society coalitions in Canada that MCC played an instrumental role in founding, although unlike CFGB, these were fully independent from the start and didn't rely solely on MCC for their birth. Also important to consider are MCC initiatives that were able to find a previously existing institutional home. This includes things like the Horn of Africa project that was housed at Conrad Grebel's Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, or the International Conciliation Services, which morphed into or laid important groundwork for the Center for Justice and Peace Building to emerge at Eastern Mennonite University. Finally, there are many other instances where MCC may not have spun off a new organization from within, but nonetheless lent its support to initiatives that emerged from within its constituency. And there are lots of examples of this. One fairly recent one from my region is Menno Homes in Kitchener-Waterloo, an affordable housing provider that emerged in 2001, less than a year after MCC convened a working group that eventually grew to upwards of 40 leaders in the community to really take hold and run with that agenda on their own. So the implications, wrapping up here with some overall reflections and thoughts. The key questions that this remarkable extended family tree raises for me are what generated MCC's incubation capacity, and how can this be expressed in MCC's current context? I should be clear that there's really no such thing as a typical MCC spin-off story. Different historical moments and geographic contexts matter, and the small number of rationales I've introduced here, things like accessing new funding, requiring a different kind of expertise, and building an ecosystem, certainly lacks some nuance. That some MCC programs moved toward independence and others did not can almost appear random or accidental, rather than being strategic or consistent in approach. Interpersonal dynamics and administrative complexities certainly lie beneath the surface of each of these stories. Indeed, the more I talk to people involved in the development of these programs that were eventually spun off, the more it became clear that the personalities of the individuals involved mattered enormously. So maybe an obvious point to make, but MCC has attracted and empowered lots and lots of creative and resourceful people with big personalities and a bias for action. The movers and shakers in the Mennonite world, to quote Esther Epstein. I find that it's often assumed that Mennonites with a more entrepreneurial bent would be drawn to an organization like MEDA rather than MCC. But if Howard Stevenson from the Harvard Business School is right in arguing that entrepreneurship is simply the pursuit of opportunity without regard to the resources currently controlled, and an entrepreneur is simply someone whose reach exceeds their grasp, then MCC has been full of entrepreneurs, or better, full of social entrepreneurs who are focused on creating social or community value. Is this still the case, though? MCC has, for lots of understandable reasons, shifted its staffing model from relying on large numbers of volunteers or service workers who move in and out of the organization relatively quickly, often on more than one occasion, to relying on long-term employees with professional experience. There are fewer pathways into MCC, and perhaps many more alternative pathways for the changemakers in MCC's constituency who are interested in making a difference in their communities. In addition to having been a big tent for Anabaptist Mennonites who wanted to make a difference, MCC has been a big tent for lots of issues of concern. MCC's history is marked by, as Alan Weaver puts it, a creative churning of new projects and initiatives. And one implication is that the organizational culture has emphasized learning through doing rather than grand plans and overly ambitious goals. And the impulse or reflexive approach toward many of the issues raised was to find an alternative solution rather than gravitating toward an existing approach. MCCers, like Anabaptist Mennonites more generally, have long been fond of alternative countercultural models. The sheer breadth of MCC's programs meant that it would be inevitable that some of these alternative models, these third-way experiments or demonstration plots, would begin to stretch the bounds of MCC's mission. And that scenario seems far less likely in an era when conventional wisdom insists on focus, not breadth. One historical driver of this sense that all kinds of issues might or should be MCC's concern may have been the significant degree of overlap among MCC's leaders and the leaders of Anabaptist Mennonite churches and agencies in other sectors. Institutional boundaries in this respect were much more permeable in the past than they are now, and institutional agendas were more fluid. At the same time, the borders between MCC's constituencies and their surrounding communities have clearly become more permeable. And it is no longer safe to assume that our first impulse in addressing an issue in the world is to start by collaborating with those within our Anabaptist Mennonite community. To use an expression from the political scientist Mark Zachary Taylor, I think that until recent decades, MCC has been able to leverage the creative insecurity of Anabaptist Mennonites. Taylor's theory is that when people have a greater sense of otherness or opposition with their surrounding culture, their creative energy is amplified and focused on those external tensions and threats from beyond. But the other way, organizational creativity will diminish when we are more secure in our broader context, because then we tend to become preoccupied with internal tensions and threats. So, to wrap up, does this lens of MCC as an incubator nuance and complement other frames, such as MCC as a service placement or partner-driven agency, or is it also a relic of the past? As MCC enters its second century, I actually don't think that the crucial question is whether it can continue to incubate new spin-offs. After all, there are lots of other incubators around that do this work. The crucial question is, how can MCC's organizational culture foster ongoing learning and creativity in order to remain faithful to its mission in a new context? How can MCC continue to innovate? I think that lessons from a century of incubating new organizations can still be relevant for this question. To quote from my conversation with Harold Miller, I think MCC would continue to be well served by practicing a vulnerability to open-ended, unowned results. MCC would continue to be well served by practicing a vulnerability to open-ended, unowned results. And this is more than just the MCC way. Miller referred to this as its Christian genius. Thank you. And apologies again for the sound issues.
All right, excellent. Paul, thank you so much. And even at the lower end of the sound spectrum, it was still completely audible. So I don't think we missed anything there. Yeah, well, these three presentations give us plenty of opportunity to raise a number of interesting and interrelated questions. So I'm going to encourage the audience to pop these into the Q&A or to, put them into the Q&A, and we'll wait for a minute for that to fill up. And in the meantime, perhaps I will lead off with a question, and we'll see where we go from there. Paul, just because you just finished up, I'm hesitant to make you speak further, but I couldn't help. I had to go back to some notes I had, something I didn't get a chance to say earlier. So it's a way of me sort of putting in the too much material I had in my own talk. But there's this phrase from completely out of context here from MCC working in Bolivia. Well, that's a bit of context, saying, we need to phase ourselves out of the present operation, a tapering off process that must be explained. And in the same sort of document boasting that the organization now has no powers of coercion and control whatsoever over the community that they've been working with. And so, kind of came into this context, set up what was perhaps a dynamic program, and then couldn't wait to sort of get out the door as soon as possible, right? And the logic there was perhaps avoiding paternalism or something else like that. And I'm interested to get a bit of a further take on what's driving this. Do we want to say it's strategic, or maybe even be a little bit cynical and say there's a worry about risk as these programs expand or sort of defer it on to others? Is there a fear that consolidating the programs might run into hurdles that MCC as an incubator is not going to be prepared to take the whole way? And when in that quote noting that the process must be explained to the people involved, do you think there's some of these spin-off organizations, as you term them, that might have seen that process as disappointing in some way or difficult as MCC relinquished control, or was there more of an eagerness to really be free from constraint, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and not to completely punt on it, but of course context, like I was saying, can matters enormously, and the personalities involved can matter enormously. And so frankly, in some cases, I think it did come down to some interpersonal challenges between leaders that was driving a move towards separation. So I can't speak to that particular context. All that is to say, and just to acknowledge that I think probably some of the more telling and interesting work around this would be to dwell more on the cases that didn't go so well. So the organizations that floundered when they spun off, or that, you know, the programs that you know, floundered and went by the wayside for a variety of reasons too. And so there's clearly, I think, a lot of instructive learning to come from that too. Yeah, so again, that's not really providing an answer to that specific question, but I do think it does speak to there was a larger sensibility within MCC in, again, being this big tent tackling so many diverse issues, realizing, I think, that for it to hold together, MCC was only in a position to go so far, whether it was, you know, in issues related to fair trade and you know, creating a movement in that space, or disability activism. These are all good things. MCC simply just, you know, wouldn't be able to hold together if too many of those things started to run their logical course. And so it was a matter of kind of getting out of the way. But that also is a point of tension, I think, with a desire for MCC, particularly in sort of more of a partnership mindset where, you know, MCC doesn't just drop in and drop out. Like, MCC is in it for the long game, right? And ready to stand by people. And that, I think that principle is definitely in tension with this other desire to really let things go and make space again for the next interesting thing to come along.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And we've got a couple questions in here now. The first one, just a brief one for Allison, and that is, why were 10,000 village shops discontinued in Canada? So it's a fairly specific question. And then I'll just add the second one in here. This is a question for all the presenters from Diane Drieger, who I believe is the same individual mentioned in Ryan Patterson's presentation. Introduce themselves at the start. And the question is, for all presenters, was there evidence of pushback, in quotes, from the Mennonite constituency that is made up of conservative Mennonites to more liberal-leaning Mennonites when MCC was involved in incubation projects that could be called advocacy, in quotes, or dealing with the political powers that be? Question, what was the tension within the MCC boards in Canada, the US, and the greater Mennonite constituency? So any of you that want to tackle that question, perhaps Allison and Ryan first, and then we can come back to Paul.
I can address the first question about Villages Canada. So yeah, as I mentioned, Villages Canada closed its operation in 2020. This was after many years of financial losses that Villages Canada had experienced. And it just became untenable for MCC to continue to support Villages Canada. You know, in retrospect, I'm sure there's lots of reflection about how that could have been avoided, but generally speaking, there was kind of a decline in the sales in the brick and mortar stores. There was lots of hope put into online sales and wholesale sales that didn't come to fruition. And there were many years where MCC was subsidizing Villages Canada, and that just became not possible anymore. So there's others, I'm sure, listening that were part of those decisions. I don't have all of the details of the business decisions, but generally speaking, that's what was needed. But I would say that, you know, one of the original visions for this work was for it to be self-sustaining, and it's a difficult marketplace, fair trade, and it became not self-sustaining. So I think it did kind of run its course, and MCC had the humility to recognize that. I'll maybe let Ryan answer the other question.
So first, hi Diane. I realized as just before we started that, like, if we were live, I'd be able to say, like, and she's here tonight, but I realized I hadn't checked if you were going to be here, so I didn't want to call out if without knowing. So yes, Diane is here. My first general statement is that I'm not a constituent member, and I know that sort of tension, probably I'm missing a lot of it that might, well, I'm not that there is. I would miss it because it's not necessarily going to show up in documentary evidence as much. That said, the few discussions I have seen where this was an issue, and of course, as other papers in this conference has brought up, is an issue that comes up, that discussion of what's the right way to different opinions of what is the type of institution that should be supported. I think that a lot of the, and I'm using the word conservative because it was in the question again, like I read about DPI more generally, and I've been really excited to learn the amount that I have about the MCC, but I certainly know I'm no, especially in this room, considered expert. So where those conservative elements might be resistance, paternalism covered for it, because we are talking here about support for disabled people. So although the initial although the mission statement of DPI said that it was a matter of justice, not charity, and I don't think the conservative elements would disagree with that, but when you're gathering funds, it is, charity works. If some people in some committees are thinking of this more as supporting, let's say, the downtrodden, rather than as really what it is a political institution. I know there was some tension about it being related to the UN and the amount that Henry was working with the UN, because, I mean, again, my level of understanding is, for some people, render under Caesar is kind of the logic, but I know it's more complicated than that. But that didn't necessarily, that I've seen, stand in the way, because in a room, in a committee, at least those who lean that way could think, okay, but we are providing charity to a disability association. So that kind of covered it, and didn't, as opposed to with the entrepreneur examples where I didn't know about this until these talks, but I'm seeing where profit is being made, that can be a barrier for some people. That kind of was never going to happen with DPI, and doesn't really. It is ultimately charitable. So that's my side of that.
Can I just briefly weigh in on that? I mean, that was the question I was going to have for you, Ryan. My perked up when I heard you say, like, in the early 1980s, MCC was, and this initiative was talking about justice, not charity, because I think that dynamic, frankly, continues to be a flashpoint for some within MCC's constituencies. That yeah, it's easier to convene support when it's a matter of charity, but anyway. So if it's live in 2021, it would have been cutting edge in 1981 for Henry to be kind of leading that charge internally with MCC, I would imagine. So yeah, I'd love to see more about the internal discussion, not necessarily even just the external constituents. But in response to Diane's question too, I guess I would say that I think I mentioned MCC had a hand in Canada in the establishment of a number of interchurch coalitions that were focused primarily on advocacy. So the Church Council on Justice and Corrections in 1972, Project Plowshares looking at disarmament issues in 1976, Kairos in 2001, and three of the predecessor interchurch coalitions behind Kairos involved in a range of issues MCC played a significant leadership role in. However, again, I wouldn't characterize those as being incubated by MCC, because they depended on many others to find their life and to be nurtured into their mandates and efforts. So yeah, I mean, I could pontificate on or speculate on how strategic that was on the part of MCC, again, to maybe be involved in advocacy on some tougher issues without being, in the front of the line in the eyes of constituents, like whether that was, how helpful that was strategically. Certainly MCC contributed significantly to those efforts, even when there were times of pushback.
Great. Well, we have another question here from Tina Fair-Keller. Are there any other examples, and this could be for Ryan or for anyone else, of MCC simply providing the space and funding to begin an organization like DPI? And Tina also says, thank you for your presentation. She's worked in MCC in Manitoba for years and had never heard of this project before. So exciting to learn about it.
Thank you for the question, Tina. And I suspect other speakers might have something to contribute, but I'll start. Yes, contemporaneous with this, it's something I'm working on right now that I didn't know existed. So I came to Winnipeg only knowing about the DPI example, and as soon as I started pulling out the boxes, and with the wonderful help from the Heritage Archives team, I kept stumbling on all this information about the independent living centers, because it's all happening at the same time, which is what makes everything doubly amazing. That first of all, just that Henry and Diane and Jim were doing the work of the DPI stuff while also setting up other projects. And also that MCC was simultaneously increasing funding to all of these areas. And the area, so the area that I'd highlight that I'm just finishing writing on is the independent living centers. And it was in a sense a very similar situation. Enns was the director of the independent. So the idea with these is that they now exist with actual people living in them, but the actual people living in them, they now exist as actual residential space. But the initial idea for quite some time, and still the heart of it, is very much the self-help. I think I found a lot overlap, but my ears pricked up a lot during Allison's talk, that it's that the idea is by having a center to organize if you can't get dressed in the morning, someone can help you get dressed. That's actually covered now. You don't need to be in an institution if that was the only issue, the simplification. But that means space. And the MCC worked with, I'm trying to think, of course I wasn't presenting on that. They supported Enns and Drieger and Lois Siemens on VS programs. So again, their time, which was incredibly valuable. And I believe, at least in the case of Lois, and I won't give names, but I know that actually did involve, I think, some salary as well as living support. They also helped rent space in a building, which was both a provision of funds, but also they have connections all over Winnipeg, so they were able to get a lease, and it was much more easy done through the MCC. So yeah, basically that's it. Again, set up a different office, like a different, actual physically different office. At the same time, they were helping set up the DPI office and helping provide the people who can organize it, and then actually giving substantial donations of money as well. And that as well was also in constant negotiation with governments. None of this was done by MCC alone. But none of it was done by governments alone as well. And it was often MCC staff who was doing that negotiation. So a lot of those same issues came up there. That's enough for me.
Well, thank you, Ryan. There's just a small note in the comments from Diane, who notes that the IL centers are not residences. They are information hubs for starting new projects run by disabled people. So perhaps a point of clarification or a note I see there.
Yes, I said that wrong. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm waiting on a few extra questions from the audience, and I wouldn't mind turning back a little bit to Allison. Allison, do you want to address a bit of the gendered effects of fair trade, and perhaps on the part of those who may have pioneered it, like Edna Ruth Byler that you mentioned, as well as those artisans that were working on the other side of the equation. Sort of an open-ended question there, but I'd appreciate your thoughts as I see that mentioned a little bit in some of the specific examples about job creation. But.
Yeah, sure. So especially when it started, it very much was thought of as a women-to-women project. So Byler being one of the first person to kind of initiate the work, and then a lot of other women kind of formed around her to support that work. They were selling, embroidery pieces specifically to other women in North America. So it was very much women created products being sold by women to other women. And then when, for example, when the job creation program started in Bangladesh, it was explicitly for rural women in Bangladesh. It expanded, and there's artisans, male and female artisans, later on in the program, but it certainly started as a way to support livelihoods for women. So there was that angle throughout the beginnings of both self-help crafts and job creation program.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And did that play on into the consumption end as well in terms of sales? Was there a thought to this in terms of marketing and sales, which you talked a little bit about in your presentation?
That's a good question. I don't know, actually. I imagine the marketing wing of Villages would have thought about that, but I didn't come across anything explicitly. But yeah, interesting question.
Okay. And I've monopolized my my role enough. So we have another question here from Rick Bauman for any panelist. MCC presently works through longer range strategic plans. Does this contribute to fewer pathways into MCC, as Paul suggested? If so, what might be the impacts of this? So open up to any of the presenters.
I have some thoughts, but I don't need to jump in yet if someone else wants to speak to it.
I don't think I'd have anything valuable to contribute.
I think so. So I mean, clearly, like, we are operating in a different context in terms of like the conventional wisdom about, as I mentioned, that organizations need to focus. They don't need to expand their breadth in order to succeed. I mean, that's I think the wisdom, and the strat plans are a tool in that. I don't know if the strategy and having a long-term strategy is as much of a problem as maybe the evaluation or the intended like what the indicators of success are. And so that's where I think this whole notion that I was trying to, again, just didn't do justice in my concluding remarks to this, but just to spin it out a bit further, and this notion of, if MCC being, a generous and generative organization, I guess one thought would be, I here like to maybe quote somebody else. Greg Jones at Duke University talks about how, to be healthy, any organization, and particularly any organization that claims to be spirit-filled, so faith-based organizations, needs to produce way more goods than it has the capacity to capture value from. And so I think that I think describes well this mode of operating that MCC has embodied through its first 100 years. The goods and the impacts go beyond what MCC itself can attribute or claim credit for. And so, regardless of the strategy, I think that can be still a sensibility that can guide an approach for an organization like MCC. So that's just one thought in response to a really big question.
I'm going to hit you all with another really big question. Art to Fair asks, is MCC really an organization or a placeholder for the desire of Mennonites working together? Sometimes helpful and sometimes an obstacle. Any follow-up thoughts on that?
Sorry, I don't need to monopolize the responses here. My response to that, though, would be, I mean, it's maybe another way of characterizing an evolution of MCC, that in the past it was a gathering point. It was a big tent. It was more of the placeholder where Mennonites gathered together, and it's become much more of an organization. I mean, that's, again, part of the product of being in the context we're in. And in both cases, it can be helpful. In both cases, it could be obstacles could be encountered. I mean, I think the larger point, the more interesting point to me, is to wrestle a bit more, though, with, and I think this has implications for MCC regardless of, whether it's more of the placeholder or more of the organization, it'd be a debatable point, but is the default for MCC's Mennonite constituency to get together to solve problems in the way that it has been in the past, to look for somewhere to convene and work together on things? I think the default, frankly, more and more is to look elsewhere in our communities, locally or globally. And I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. Lots of good things can come from that as well, but it's a very different mode. And so even if MCC was the big tent, I'm curious to know how many Mennonites would show up to work together on things in ways they have in the past. But I'd be happy to hear others engage on that point in the comments or beyond this.
Whether it's, I'd certainly like, the thing I'd add is that one thing I've certainly learned, and I'm still learning, is that the MCC is very good at organizing. So that's not the philosophical question, but when groups at least put their mind to getting something practical done to help people, there is a tremendous value that in that inbuilt institutional knowledge, and the fact that there are people who know how to organize, that they do go from one project to another. So that's me coming in after the what should it be or what it is originally, but it is very good at the organization part, and I think there is a tremendous value to that.
We've got a comment question here from Phil Fountain, who's still got energy after getting up in the middle of the night, I believe, to join us from New Zealand. He says, a comment question for Paul and perhaps others. One reading of MCC history is that part of its relentless creativity and its propensity to create and spin off organizations is a pronounced subsidiarity. Country reps or program managers have traditionally been trusted to know what to do and were empowered to do it. Practically, this has meant that every change of leadership at the programmatic level was a potential change of ideology or philosophy of service, and therefore also a change in activities and initiatives. This leads to a prolific approach to producing initiatives which require a certain level of independence in order to stabilize and endure. Do you see this as a potential factor?
Yeah, I would say yes. I mean, I think lots of others have noted that the basic mode of MCCs operating in the past is like find good people and tell them to do good things and trust that they'll figure things out and make an impact. That kind of autonomy and independence is certainly not something we experience in our present context for lots of good reasons. Yeah, so I do think that's for sure that kind of like a very decentralized, loosely organized structure can enable a lot of generativity, creativity, and some of the stories that I was alluding to are probably certainly products of that as well. I mean, just hearing, Ryan talking about Henry's like approach. I mean, he's obviously very, very driven and collaborative. But I mean, he was given some terrain and he ran with it, and look what he was able to do. I think there are lots of stories like that where when MCCers were given license and encouragement, or even just permission, they were able to run pretty far with it.
There's a bit of a side chat here as well going on about MCC's role as a justice advocacy organization, at its core historically, or a charity. And we have a comment. I think initially it was a charity to help our own brethren. This branched off, society changed regarding new social movements. So I think that's sort of a tension that you've already addressed a little bit, Ryan and Paul as well, right? About perhaps also willingness to support under different mentalities, either as a charity or advocacy. But do you or Allison want to comment further on that notion?
I'd be interested in hearing Allison reflect a bit more on, again, this the dynamic, maybe in particular with the MCC job creation projects, where again, at its core, it was about creating, meaningful change in the lives of women who were working there, but was also struggling with this dynamic of needing to have a sustainable business model in order for that to work. I mean, so it seems like in that case, again, justice is an issue, but the companion isn't charity. The companion is the viability of these as businesses. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, well said. I don't know if I have much more to say on that, but just that there was this, as I talked about, this tension, because it did look so different from a lot of other MCC programs where it wasn't really a charity model. It was about creating businesses, and that didn't feel like MCC to some of the workers in Bangladesh. Like, why are we creating businesses? Is this really what MCC is doing now, is making businesses? But it was about the intention and the ultimate goal, like you said, like livelihoods, income generation, and justice for the women who were targeted through those businesses. And really the belief that that was the most sustainable way to create change in that context. But it certainly created tensions because it didn't look like the normal, quote unquote, normal MCC work, even though, as you highlighted today, I don't think there is normal MCC work. But in that case, I think there were some people in Bangladesh who struggled with that model.
And no immediate pending questions. I'm gonna throw another one in there if I may. Paul said he's not interested in history at the beginning, so this might be more about Allison and Ryan. Ryan deliberately working as a historian, and I think Allison also providing a pretty captivating historical narrative about fair trade and 10,000 villages. So what does it take to write this sort of recentist history of the MCC? What did you see for sources? Ryan, I heard you mention MHA as a repository, Allison as well. Did oral history figure prominently in the work you did to uncovering this history?
I did some interviews with MCC staff who were in Bangladesh at the time of the job creation program, but I also really relied heavily on the MCC archive. There are hundreds of reports about 10,000 villages, about the job creation program. And I mentioned a few of the evaluations and program reviews that had happened over the decades. And those were really rich sources for some of these broader questions that were raised. And yeah, themes that came out consistently in reporting. So that's where I mostly looked, but some oral history as well.
Yeah, I had a lot of great help from a lot. I mean, I learned about this issue, just that the fact that the MCC was so involved in the early history of DPI from another professor at the disability research group, and I was the one kind of with time, so I investigated. So I was coming in. It really did start with just kind of some cold emails. Hey, I mean, I had a few contacts, but and immediately the people were the Heritage Archives. It was very forthcoming, very happy to have me, but also really well organized. I've been in a lot of archives, and it is at like British National Archives at Q level, where like you're interested in DPI, here's the actual boxes and they're in order and you can flip through them and it's all together. And there's even like, there'll be several editions of like Henry's speech where he's made corrections and all that stuff that historians love, but so often, understandably, when you have to clear out space, is the stuff that doesn't get held over. So it's a really, and I've made sure to spread that as much as I can, because I for other historians who aren't necessarily involved in Winnipeg to know that resource is there. But also, yeah, oral history, I was kind of limited for time and funding. And so Diane was a wonderful resource. Obviously, I witnessed the whole time, big, long interview, and lots of email communication before and since. I know there are other people that I would like to eventually talk to, and that was just a matter of me getting myself out of Toronto and actually or over Zoom now, I suppose, to do it. But yes, yeah, mix of oral and documentary, and both are really well provided, at least in the areas I was looking into.
So Ben, I'm not a historian, as you know, but I didn't mean to besmirch the work of careful historical work. But I should say, you know, there's a surprising number of good institutional histories for a lot of these spin-offs that have been written, which is interesting. But of course, they start from their birth story, from, you know, being released from MCC. And so, yeah, I think to do a proper job, and some of the MCC side of that story is covered well by, Esther Aptison touches on a number of these in her history of MCC in Canada. But certainly, yeah, I'd love to, and a proper reading of this complex and nuanced history would require good archival work. I did have conversations, interviews with 16 people who gave me some kind of eyewitness accounts of their vantage point anyway, and there's definitely some contested memories.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, you point to something kind of interesting, that perhaps the sources kind of vanish from the archive at the point that these organizations become interesting as they spin off. So that might present a bit of a methodological challenge there. Excellent. Yeah, I ask only in part because we now have at least two potential dissertation topics offered by panelists to the audience in general at this conference. I'm hoping to elicit a few more, if there's any students listening out there. I'm going to look once more at the Q&A. I think we might have something else that popped up. Yeah. Okay, so we have from Ed Nice writes in here, Paul, you mentioned that it is also interesting to look at spin-offs that did not last. Do you have a sense of the percentage of how many have or have not lasted? Also, do you think our view of this part of MCC's history changes if we are most aware of what have lasted or have not lasted? Okay.
Yeah, good to hear from Ed. Hello, Ed. So of that initial spreadsheet I got from the MCC US Archives, I think there were 138 organizations. I think over 100 of those no longer were functioning. So most of them. Now, having said that, of that 138, I think I found another 14 or 15 that weren't in that original list. But yeah. And I think, yeah, and I think I've alluded to this already. I do think that there could be a lot to be learned from the failure stories, and even the failure stories, the stories of the organizations that are no longer functioning. Because those, again, I don't think they have to be failure stories. I would argue that the 10,000 Villages Canada is not a failure story. It's a success story. It had a remarkable run and huge impact in a lot of communities around the world, whether it's through the artisans who were supported, the volunteers in the stores, the people who, like me, who love the products and have decorated their homes and continue to benefit from that. But I guess, yeah, so success doesn't mean perpetuity, right? In my mind. So I think the Villages story. But there's things that we can learn from why things might falter. And there are certainly cases of that would fit the definition of failure in the most negative sense that I'm sure we could learn from. Do you agree with that, Allison? I don't know. I mean, obviously it's a loss for a lot of people, and certainly the people whose livelihoods were impacted by that. I'm definitely definitely feel for that, but I don't know that. And moreover, when part of that Villages story is really about creating the movement for fair trade, right? And all the cascading impacts and ripples that have gone out from that hard work continue today, even if Villages in Canada only has a handful of stores to sell products.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely not an easy decision. But like you said, not only the organization starting having ripple effects, but a lot of people who are involved going on to other organizations being involved in the World Fair Trade Organization. MCC was really a starting place for a lot of people. And I did see a question in the Q&A about what about the artisans who sold their products to Villages, and now that Villages in Canada is not operating anymore, what happens to those artisans and their livelihood? So I just wanted to touch on that. It's a small sample, but that impact evaluation that I spoke about that was done in 2019 did look at what percentage of sales of an organization's total sales was to Villages. And of the organizations that it looked at, 2% to 10%, there was a range, 2 to 10% of their overall sales was to Villages. So actually not a lot. And I think this is a testament to the fact that as was found in the evaluation, a lot of organizations, Villages was really influential in the beginning. Being a regular buyer, being a buyer with a good reputation really helped to support those. But then as those organizations grew, they expanded who they were selling their products to. So Villages was not a majority buyer anymore. So I think Villages Canada could end those relationships knowing that their decision to close the stores was not going to have a huge impact on those organizations. And I'll also just say that Villages US is also still operating, and is still purchasing for many of those organizations.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you for catching that question from Diane. We have just another comment, actually, Allison, maybe you want to speak to this too, just from Art noting, that job creation in Bangladesh, Art writes, is a joint venture with Oxfam and Catholic Relief. Do you want to talk a little bit about the institutional relationship there between those organizations and the artisans?
Yeah, well, I'm sure Art could speak to this more than I could actually, but I do know, yeah, that there were many elements of that project that were not MCC alone. I don't know many of the specific details, so feel free, Art, to add more on the chat. But yeah, just to note that a lot of this was collaboration with other organizations wanting who had similar goals.
And a few more coming in through the chat as well. One, I don't know if, oh, that's from Alan Harder. Is the purpose of an organization to be sustainable or to run its course and then dissipate when it is done what it set out to do and when the need and context changes? Does anyone want to tackle that? I see a bit of a nod from Paul there.
I think I've already tipped my hand there, that I think perpetuity isn't the goal, impact is the goal, and there can be a time and place where we're in a position to do that. It doesn't mean we have to, yeah. I definitely don't think perpetuity should be the goal. Hey, just one other shout out too to the archive fans. I mean, MCC, to its credit, again, this isn't like an incubated project, but it's MCC was certainly a catalyst behind the impetus that led to the formation of historical societies across Canada, and some of the people who've done a lot of that good work. So not only does MCC have good archives, but they've been part of the backbone that's made that possible for a lot of other organizations as well.
I can attest to that myself. It's part of MHSC and MMSC, no, MMHS. The acronym is confusing me, but we have one more, some more organizations.
Ben, could I just speak to that? Sorry,
yeah.
Before you move on, just to add to what Paul was saying. Yeah, I would agree that the goal is not to have have an organization be there for forever, and I think Villages is a good example of that. It was a financial loss for many years. So at what point does the emotional and historical connection of MCC to Villages and that desire to hold on to that, because it has an important history, because it was so impactful in the fair trade industry, because we like the idea of it, is that enough of a reason to hold on and to continue an organization that's actually losing money? I think, no, it's not. And if we're honest with what is the goal of the organization, it leads to some of those hard decisions to end, which I know, yeah, was the case with Villages. But if it's not going to be sustainable, then yeah, we shouldn't kind of push that to the point where it's actually harming financially anyway. So sorry to interrupt. Just want to add that.
Thank you for adding that. I appreciate that. Ryan, did you want to comment on that as well?
I think what I would add has mostly been covered by the kind of spin-off discussion. But I mean, with Disabled People International was never solely an MCC thing, and therefore it has been sustainable. And it's not that MCC is totally disconnected from it, but it's not like its hands aren't all over the central committee running it in the way it was back in 1980. So in that sense, I see that kind of as a helping it, and that is in those earlier phases where money transfers are difficult, and actually the credibility thing was a huge benefit, and then it was able to survive on its own. So I'd call that a success, but it's also a different thing because it was helping almost a separate institution, and I would call that a great success of it.
Great, and then Ruth Clements has a comment as well that the list of 136 organizations started by MCC is quite remarkable. What it doesn't include are the countless organizations that were developed in various countries of MCC service, with the support of MCC staff being involved as collaborators in NGO or partner networks. I could think of 3 examples of organizations that still exist in Cambodia, which MCC Cambodia staff participated in their origins in the early 1990s.
Yeah, just to acknowledge again, I think the fruits of MCC can be extended in all kinds of other ways beyond like spinning off. I mean, that's one model for generating you know, ongoing impact. But yeah, in countless countries there'd be scenarios like that, and where this partnership model that MCC's embraced now for decades certainly borne all kinds of fruit. Where it gets a little trickier is, you know, I mean, and that's good, right? MCC in many of these cases is one of many actors though as well, right? And just to acknowledge that reality, that the ongoing success requires collaboration with many others, which again I think is a good thing. It's stretched us, and but to Ruth's point, absolutely, there are many partners that could be talked about in that way.
And we've got getting close to the end of our session here, just a few minutes left. So just a comment first from Harold Jantz, and noting, you know, that about the assistance that MCC gave when some of us were working to bring together a conference on faith in the media. This is an effort to help the Canadian media to recognize the role that faith plays in decisions and choices people and organizations make. We needed a place where funds could initially be lodged. We asked MCC to do that for us, and they did. The conference drew a wide group of media people and faith groups together for a 96 conference. MCC kind of helped at that critical time. So that's just a comment from Harold. And then we've got Rick Bauman with another question. MCC's work in handicap concerns was phased out eventually. What thoughts do any of you have about how MCC decided what to spin off and what was core to its identity?
All right, if I start briefly on the handicap concerns, yes, and I think that made some sense, because when handicap concerns was started, it was an internal project with a very set goal: increase awareness of disability issues among constituent communities, and not initially, but very quickly, make all of the churches and buildings handicap, so I should say wheelchair accessible. And so it was, with that being its initial core, it was kind of logical that one would hope it would be phased out eventually, because I don't know if I can say confidently that every single building was wheelchair accessible, but basically the project was done, and then government rules have clicked into the point now that's the standard. The external projects that it then started pulling in, if for no other reason than you've got Henry and Diane there and other people wanting to start new projects. You know, the independent living movement, the independent living centers have succeeded. They've largely spun off. So that, I think there's that's a real question that I only know from this one case study, but I can see being an issue where we've talked about a project continuing and then maybe not being able to continue. But there's also the point that sometimes a project is started with very limited ideas, and it spins off. Spin off, I mean, in the other sense, it spreads into a bunch of other areas. And then, like, if your initial job was done, do you stop and make a new committee for the other ones? That's always going to be a question. But so that's the handicap one. But what are your Paul and Allison's thoughts on other areas?
Go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I'm trying, I don't think I have enough of a breadth of knowledge of the history of villages to know, as Ben said, Paul said, it was still connected very much to MCC. It did not spin off completely into its own organization. And that's interesting to note, especially because I think to the general public, it was seen as, it's a store. A lot of people didn't even know the connection to MCC, and yet it had its own board, but it was still very much tied to MCC and an MCC program. So why was that not spun off and others were? I don't know if I have an answer to that, but it's certainly a really interesting question.
Yeah, I guess just as with any priority setting exercise, like one factor I think that's guided MCC is, where is MCC in a position to make a difference, recognizing MCC's limited reach and scope and scale in comparison to society more generally or other organizations. And so I think that's it's striking how many times MCC has ended up having an impact far beyond what might have been expected. But at the same time, yeah, so I don't know if it's as much, if it's also just, if it's about identity, but also just MCC understanding its position in a particular historical context, right? And so the issue or the initiative in one time and place could and should be held closely and nurtured further, and in other cases released. Like, I'm thinking about this even in terms of advocacy priorities. There's no shortage of important justice issues for MCC to speak to. I think one of the guiding principles historically has been where can MCC really add an important contribution that otherwise wouldn't be there.
Well, we've made it all the way to the end of our session, and this has been just an absolute pleasure to speak with you, Allison and Paul and Ryan, and thanks to the audience for these great thought-provoking questions. We just have one final note from Esther Aptison, which reflects, I think, what you said as well, Ryan, that when the objectives have been achieved, sometimes we see new things emerging as well. So mental health programs emerge kind of out of that initial impetus that fed into the disability program. So thank you all, and have a wonderful night. And please do join us bright and early tomorrow at 8 a.m. For our next session, whose name I do not currently have in front of me. Give me 1 second. We are kicking off with MCC and peace building tomorrow in the morning with Stephanie Stone. And thanks so much. And thank you, Evan, from the University of Winnipeg, who's been with us all day. So have a good night and take care.